Thanks for being with us on Morning Live. Now, this week, power utility Eskom presented its plans to change its electricity pricing structure to the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. And this includes moving away from Incline Block Tariffs of IBT, which is when the cost of electricity increases the more you use it. Now, not using IBT will mean that there will be some of the cost relief for households consuming more power. But it will also increase some basic costs for those who use less. And tariffs would also be structured according to peak and off-peak times. And to help us discuss and understand this further, we're joined by Dr. Stephen Labson, who is a former consultant to Eskom and an advising economist with expertise in energy and infrastructure. Dr. Labson, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning.
So let's start by, just getting a better understanding of the suggested changes. If you could explain to us, in a nutshell, the existing billing system, which is called the Incline Block Tariffs or IBT, what that is, how it works, and what these changes are actually suggesting.
Yes, the inclining block is an idea of for each increase in customer usage, say at residential level, maybe after your first 2,000 kilowatt hours of use per month, the unit rate, the charge per kilowatt hour will increase by a bit. Eskom estimates that for large residential users, the reduction in this increase in charges could add up to some 270 Rand per month, and then that's offset by a corresponding increase in monthly bill to lower users of perhaps 100, 120 Rand per month.
So in this structure, would it be correct to say then that the more electricity you buy, the more expensive the power costs?
That's right. That's the idea. The idea behind it, behind using it, is to incentivize through pricing less use of energy. On the other hand, Eskom's arguing that it really hasn't had that impact. Eskom argues that customers are not very price responsive, so that they don't really change their usage patterns based on the price. Eskom also proposes that the increasing block rate doesn't reflect the true cost of supplying power. Again, at residential level, for example, they view that the cost of supply is relatively flat and justifies the doing away with this inclining block structure.
So, Dr. Labson, at what point of electricity usage or megawatts does this happen?
Well, it would be different in different areas, but again, it's roughly, I know in my bill, it's roughly after the first 2,000 kilowatt hours, which is, to put that in perspective for people, that would be as much as a modest household would use in a month. On the other hand, it's not extraordinary to see other households using maybe 5,000 or 6,000 kilowatt hours per month, and then that increasing block of an extra, in my bill again, perhaps an extra 25% charge would start to kick in on each additional kilowatt hour used in the month.
So just coming back to the rationale for Eskom as to why they would want to move away from the current structure, and how will the power utility possibly see changes, and how would they gain should these changes go ahead?
Well, this is where I think it becomes interesting. Certainly the inclining block and everything about the tariff structure is important to people, every residence, every company, industry. But I think reading between the lines is even more important. I think it foretells the future of the industry itself. Eskom does allude to this in terms of competing against photovoltaics at residential level and other renewables where their pricing schedule might be different. It's really can be seen as a strategic move to compete against new technologies in energy supply. And in that regard, I think the entire proposal other issues like time of use and other tariff structures that we might have time to get to, start to come into play, where it puts Eskom on a different competitive footing compared to the incoming household power generation and medium scale, even own use by commercial and industrial suppliers. It's basically just trying to level out or even lower the price of supply, which might seem counterintuitive at first glance, but it's not in terms of Eskom wanting to remain a very important player in the supply of electricity.
Now, how would charging differently between peak and off-peak hours actually affect households in their pockets? Because if you think about it, the peak hours are actually in the evenings, for example, when people get off work. So let's talk to that, because, this is where it gets very real.
Yes. They proposed to change the billing. I'm sure many of your audience aren't fully aware, but there would be different rates that were all charged at different times of day. Currently, there's some 3 hours, I believe, in the morning hours and 2 to 3 hours in the evening hours, where in a traditional electricity system, demand increases. Pre-COVID, you can imagine getting up to go to work. Everyone turns on their showers and cooks breakfast, uses quite a bit of power across the entire country. The same for coming home. You get home, start to cook dinner, do a few other odds and ends that need electricity, and there'd be a spike in demand. Utilities around the world typically will charge more for that because, one, to flatten the usage, so people will use more at other hours of the day, so it doesn't require additional power generating facilities. But that too is changing. First of all, the cost of supply is changing its shape with renewables that flood the market in some countries with cheap power during the sunlight hours, and then of course don't have it at the later evening hours when people get home, especially in the winter when that starts at perhaps 5 o'clock in the evening, and that power is not available. More expensive power generating units have to come online to satisfy that demand. So it's an idea of leveling the price to the cost of supply of energy in real-time basis, or at least on an hourly basis, because it does. Base load power stations, the big coal-fired power stations, and the renewables in South Africa make the cost of electricity extremely cheap during the middle of the day. But in the evenings, more expensive when it's needed if there's not the sun shining and there's a need to use diesel-fired power plants in addition to the base load coal-fired stations.
So overall, if we look at this, is it a better system for consumers, one, or is it a better system for Eskom, or can both benefit?
Well, it's highly contentious. There'll always be winners and losers. And there's also a matter of equity, fairness, and affordability and government policy that comes into play. So it's not easy to say one particular group of customers or all customers will gain. There's many losers and winners between different types of customers. We've already talked very little bit about the inclining block. The move that Eskom proposes will benefit the higher electricity users, as I said, by some 270 Rand per month. You also have different categories in terms of residential versus commercial versus large industrials and municipalities. Those comparative rates have also been changed. The overall guiding policy directed by government is that the costs reflect, the charges reflect the underlying cost of supplying power. Now, that seems like it should be simple to solve, but today in South Africa, that's actually extremely difficult. The load shedding and the capacity problems that Eskom's facing means that the cost at any particular time of day to any user may change considerably from day to day as different large power generating stations are in or out of service. Also have the large networks, the wires that bring us electricity, the costs have to be recovered. Then that leads us into another very controversial aspect of tariff structure, the relative costs of your fixed charges, your monthly fixed part of the bill, versus the unit charge. That would be for each kilowatt hour you actually use, you charge for. They've also proposed to rebundle that to bring in a greater percentage of the fixed charges on your bill and less in terms of each extra kilowatt hour that you use. The logic there is, again, that the electricity industry is highly capital intensive. So many of the costs are fixed. Whether you use the system or not, it has to be maintained. The additional kilowatt hour of energy, yes, it burns more coal. The renewables don't have that marginal cost, but the system is still primarily a fossil fuel-based system. So you've got the a small energy component versus the large fixed component. That, again, how you move that relative charge affects the incentives and behavior and usage of electricity.
So the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA, now, they have been repeatedly accused of failing to actually protect consumers from above inflation electricity prices. What do you make of this, Dr. Labson, the work that NERSA has done over the years when it comes to protecting consumers?
Well, they have a hugely challenging job, that's for sure. If I might just take 5 seconds to put in perspective, the overall amount that Eskom receives in revenue per year is a separate regulatory process, the MYPD process. The way that it filters through to individual tariffs is what we've been talking about mostly today. But to get to your question, it's difficult to say. I'd say that there's still a long way to go. Regulation and pricing is never perfect, no matter where you are in the world. I think that there's still many challenges here to be resolved in terms of a more rigorous system, perhaps even a fairer system for everybody. I wouldn't just out of hand say that customers are better served by lowering costs. The system does need to be maintained. That said, I think we all realize it's public domain information now that there have been huge wastes of money through state capture in the industry. That certainly needs to be resolved. But if and when that's resolved, then the revenue that's needed to run the system securely benefits customers by having reliable power. Now, that seems a bit ironic as we speak here today with the load shedding that's going on, and that's true. There have been faults on Eskom's behalf in terms of maintaining that secure system. But let's assume that that problem is dealt with soon, and then the regulator will have the job of getting the cost of service reflected in everybody's bill.
And of course, soon is relative. But we're out of time, Dr. Labson, but I just want to put this to you. How confident are you about the power capacity overall? Because it's one thing to talk about tariffs and structures, but how confident are you about the power capacity?
I'm not terribly confident. I think there perhaps needs to be some restructuring, as government has and the president has spoke about over the last couple of years. And I think continued work in that direction could potentially help with that issue.
Well, Dr. Labson, thanks so much for your time. Dr. Stephen Labson, a former consultant to Eskom and an energy expert, talking to us about power utilities' proposed changes to the structure of its tariffs and who stands to benefit how, and also just helping us understand exactly how this is going to work. And we're going to take a quick break.